The temple bells echoed in the stillness of the early morning, their chimes carried by the soft breeze that rustled through the trees. A golden sun began to rise over the distant hills, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. In the heart of a small village, where life moved at a gentle pace, lived a saint, wise, humble, and untouched by the distractions of the world. His name was Raghavan, a man whose very presence inspired reverence. 4 years, Raghavan had devoted himself to a life of simplicity and spiritual wisdom. He spent his days meditating under the great banyan tree by the river, offering guidance to those who sought it, and reminding people that true happiness lay not in fleeting pleasures but in inner peace. His words were powerful yet gentle, capable of stirring the hearts of even the most troubled souls. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, a traveler arrived in the village. His name was Kiran, a man of ambition, charm, and endless desires. Unlike the villagers, Kiran believed that success was measured by wealth, power, and the admiration of others. He had traveled far and wide, accumulating riches and experiences, yet something within him felt incomplete. The world had given him everything he desired, yet he remained unsatisfied. Curious about the saint who had become the village's guiding light, Kiran decided to meet him. As he approached the banyan tree, he saw Raghavan sitting in deep meditation, his face radiating peace. Kiran smirked to himself. What wisdom could a man who had renounced the world possibly offer him? "Saint Raghavan," Kiran called out, breaking the silence. The saint slowly opened his eyes and looked at the young man with a calm smile. "What troubles you, my child?" Raghavan asked gently. Kiran chuckled. "Trouble? I am not troubled, saint. I have everything: money, success, admiration. Yet, people speak of you as if you hold the secret to something greater. I want to know, what is it that you possess that I do not?" Raghavan studied Kiran for a moment before responding, "You have everything the world desires, yet you are here, seeking answers. Tell me, does your heart feel at peace?" Kiran hesitated. He had not expected such a question. "Peace," he repeated. "I have no time to think about peace. I have goals to achieve, fortunes to multiply." The saint nodded knowingly. "Desires are endless, my child. A man who chases them is like a traveler trying to fill a jar with water, only to find it has no bottom. The more he pours, the emptier it feels." Kiran frowned. "So, are you saying that I should give up everything? That ambition is wrong." Raghavan smiled. "Not at all. But when desire blinds a man, he loses sight of what truly matters. Would you like to hear a story?" Kiran crossed his arms, intrigued but skeptical. "A story? All right, humor me." The saint gestured toward a small stone near the riverbank. "Sit," he said. "This story may change the way you see the world." As Kiran settled down, the wind whispered through the trees, and the river flowed steadily, as if nature itself was listening. Raghavan took a deep breath and began to speak. There was once a great king, a man of extraordinary wealth and power. He had everything: gold, palaces, servants at his command. Yet his hunger for more knew no bounds. One day, he heard of a mystical land where a hidden treasure lay buried, a treasure so vast that it would make him the richest man to have ever lived. His desire burned so fiercely that he abandoned his kingdom and set out in search of it. Kiran leaned forward, his curiosity piqued. He could sense that this was no ordinary tale. Something about the way Raghavan spoke, the depth in his voice, sent a strange shiver down his spine. Little did Kiran know, the story he was about to hear would shake the very foundation of his beliefs. It would make him question everything he had ever pursued, every decision he had ever made. And by the time the story ended, his life would never be the same again. The evening breeze carried the faint scent of jasmine as Kiran leaned in, eager to hear the saint's story. The river beside them shimmered under the moon's glow, its gentle ripples echoing the stillness of the night. Though he had arrived with skepticism, something about Raghavan's presence made Kiran restless, as if the old man could see right through him, past his wealth, past his confidence, into something deeper, something Kiran himself had ignored for too long. The king was a man of vision and determination, Raghavan began, his voice steady. He had conquered many lands, built monuments in his name, and amassed treasures beyond imagination. Yet he was never satisfied. No matter how much he possessed, his heart craved more. One evening, as he sat in his golden palace, a wise sage arrived at his court. The sage, draped in simple robes, carried nothing but a wooden staff and a knowing smile. "Mighty king," the sage said, bowing, "I have come to offer you something far greater than all your riches combined." The king's eyes gleamed with curiosity. "And what might that be?" he asked. The sage leaned in and whispered, "A hidden treasure, buried in a land far beyond your kingdom. A treasure so vast that no ruler before you has ever laid claim to it." The king sat up straighter. "Tell me where it is," he demanded, his voice filled with urgency. The sage, however, only chuckled. "Patience, your majesty. This treasure is not for the faint-hearted. It lies beyond forests darker than night, beyond mountains taller than the clouds, guarded by tests that only the worthy can overcome. If you wish to claim it, you must leave behind your crown, your soldiers, and your riches. Only then will you find it." The king hesitated. To leave behind his power, his security, it seemed absurd. Yet, the promise of such a treasure burned in his mind. What if it was real? What if it made him greater than all the rulers before him? That night, the king barely slept. The thought of the hidden treasure consumed him. By dawn, his decision was made. He left his throne in the hands of his ministers, donned the robes of a traveler, and set forth alone into the unknown. Kiran shifted where he sat. He could already sense that this story was not just about the king, it was about something much deeper. He could feel a strange tension rising within him, though he could not yet name it. The journey was not easy, Raghavan continued. The king crossed scorching deserts, braved raging rivers, and climbed mountains that scraped the sky. Each step tested his will, but the fire of desire pushed him forward. Along the way, he met people who tried to warn him. A poor farmer, tending to his crops, called out, "Where do you hurry, traveler?" "I seek a treasure greater than any known to man," the king replied proudly. The farmer only smiled and said, "I too, once chased something beyond my reach. And in doing so, I failed to see the wealth I already had. I hope you do not make the same mistake." The king merely laughed and walked on, convinced that the farmer did not understand ambition. Further ahead, an old woman by a well stopped him. "You look weary, traveler. Have you found what you seek?" "Not yet," the king admitted, wiping sweat from his brow. "But I am close, I can feel it." The woman handed him a cup of water and said, "Beware, child. Sometimes, the things we chase blind us to what truly matters." The king dismissed her words as the musings of an old woman and continued on. Days turned to weeks, and still, the treasure remained beyond his grasp. His fine robes had turned to rags, his strength had waned, but his desire had not faded. He had given up too much to turn back now. And then, one evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, he arrived at the edge of a deep, dark forest. The trees stretched endlessly, their twisted branches clawing at the sky. A cold wind whispered through the leaves, sending a chill down his spine. The treasure must be beyond this forest, he told himself. One final test. But as he stepped forward, an eerie voice echoed through the air. "Are you willing to give up the last of what you have?" The king turned sharply, but he saw no one. The voice continued, "You have left behind your kingdom, your power, and your pride. But what remains is your greatest burden. If you wish to find the treasure, you must give up even that." The king frowned. "And what is my greatest burden?" Silence followed. Then, slowly, a reflection appeared in a nearby stream. But it was not just his own image. He saw himself as he once was, adorned in gold, commanding respect, feared and admired. He saw everything he had left behind. In that moment, a terrible doubt crept into his heart. Had he been chasing a mere illusion? Had he abandoned everything for nothing? His hands trembled. His breath grew uneven. The weight of his journey suddenly felt unbearable. Kiran exhaled sharply, feeling a strange pressure in his chest. Though he sat comfortably by the riverbank, listening to Raghavan's tale, it was as if he, too, was standing at the edge of that dark forest, facing the same question. He wanted to ask what happened next, whether the king stepped forward or turned back. But something in Raghavan's eyes told him that the answer was not yet his to know. "Why are you telling me this?" Kiran finally asked, his voice quieter than before. Raghavan smiled, but it was not the kind of smile that offered reassurance. It was the kind that made Kiran uneasy, the kind that suggested he already knew something Kiran did not. "Because, my child," Raghavan said softly, "you are standing at the edge of your own forest." Kiran blinked. "What do you mean?" The saint looked toward the river, watching as the water moved effortlessly over the rocks. "You came here searching for something. You may not realize it yet, but your heart is restless. It is not wealth or success that has brought you here. It is something much deeper. But like the king, you must ask yourself, what are you truly chasing? And at what cost?" Kiran opened his mouth to argue, to insist that he was in full control of his life. But the words would not come. For the first time in years, he felt something he had long ignored: doubt. The night deepened, the air heavy with unspoken questions. And as the river continued its endless journey, Kiran could not shake the feeling that he was on the edge of something far greater than he had ever imagined. The night stretched on, quiet except for the steady hum of the river and the occasional rustling of leaves. Kiran sat in silence, his mind a storm of thoughts. He had come here expecting to meet a saint filled with simple wisdom, the kind one could listen to and forget. But this was different. Raghavan's words had burrowed deep into his mind, awakening something he had not wanted to acknowledge. The story of the king lingered in his thoughts. A ruler who had left everything behind, only to stand at the edge of a dark forest, forced to confront himself. Was Kiran any different? He had always believed that ambition was his guiding force, the thing that separated him from ordinary people. But now, for the first time, he wondered if he was simply running toward something without understanding why. Raghavan watched him quietly, his expression unreadable. He did not push, did not demand answers. Instead, he simply let the silence grow, as if he knew that Kiran was already wrestling with the questions on his own. Finally, Kiran spoke, his voice hesitant. If the king had turned back, would he have regretted it? Raghavan smiled faintly. Regret does not come from turning back, my child. It comes from realizing too late that you never truly knew what you were chasing. Kiran frowned. But isn't desire what drives us? If we stop wanting more, then what is left? The saint picked up a small stone and tossed it into the river. They both watched as the ripples spread outward, fading into the water. "Desire is like this," Raghavan said. "It moves us, pushes us forward. But if we are not careful, it blinds us, makes us believe that happiness is always somewhere ahead, never here, never now." Kiran exhaled sharply. He had spent his entire life believing that fulfillment came from achieving more, from proving himself over and over again. But as he sat here, far from the noise of his world, a nagging thought crept in. What if he had been chasing shadows all along? His thoughts were interrupted by the distant sound of voices. He turned to see a small group of villagers walking toward the riverbank, their faces filled with urgency. An elderly man stepped forward, his breath labored. "Saint Raghavan, we need your help." Raghavan stood immediately. "What has happened?" "It is Ravi," the man said. "He has fallen ill. His family fears the worst." Raghavan nodded, already moving toward the village. Kiran hesitated for only a moment before following. He did not know why. Perhaps he simply needed to occupy his mind, to escape the thoughts swirling within him. As they walked through the narrow pathways of the village, Kiran observed the people around him. Simple homes, oil lamps flickering in the dark, children peering out curiously. It was a world so different from his own, yet there was something about it that felt strangely peaceful. They reached a small hut where a group of villagers had gathered. Inside, a young man lay on a cot, his face pale, his breathing shallow. His mother knelt beside him, her hands clasped in silent prayer. Raghavan stepped forward, kneeling beside the young man. He placed a hand on his forehead, closing his eyes for a moment. The room was silent, all eyes fixed on him. "His fever is strong," Raghavan said. "Has he eaten anything unusual?" His mother shook her head. "No, Saint. But he has been working tirelessly in the fields, barely stopping to rest. He refused to slow down, no matter how much we begged him to." Kiran felt a strange tug in his chest at her words. A man pushing himself beyond his limits, refusing to stop, convinced that more effort, more struggle would bring him what he sought. The parallel was too obvious to ignore. Raghavan looked at Ravi for a long moment before speaking. "His body is exhausted. He has given so much that he has left nothing for himself. He needs rest, warmth, and time. Give him water with herbs to cool his fever, and let him sleep without disturbance." The villagers nodded, moving quickly to follow his guidance. Kiran, however, remained still, his mind replaying the words over and over again. Outside, the cool night air did little to ease the weight in his chest. He turned to Raghavan, his voice quieter now. "Do you think he will be all right?" The saint looked at him, his gaze knowing. "His body will recover. But the real question is, will he listen? Or will he push himself again, believing that stopping is a weakness?" Kiran swallowed hard. He knew the answer. Because he had been that man, running endlessly, afraid that slowing down meant failure. "You see, my child," Raghavan said, his voice gentle, "desire is not the enemy. But when it consumes you, when it becomes your master instead of your servant, you lose sight of what truly matters. You lose sight of yourself." Kiran looked away, his hands tightening into fists. "So what do I do? Just stop? Give up everything?" Raghavan shook his head. "No. But you must ask yourself, are you chasing something that will bring you peace? Or are you running from something you refuse to face?" The word struck deep, cutting through the layers of ambition, of pride, of everything Kiran had built himself upon. For the first time he was afraid, not of failure, but of the possibility that he had never truly understood what he had been searching for all along. The night deepened, and the village settled into a hush, but Kiran could not find peace. He sat by the river once more, staring at the water as it flowed endlessly forward. Raghavan's words refused to leave his mind. Was he chasing something that would bring him peace, or was he running from something he refused to face? He had never thought of it that way before. To him, ambition had always been a straight road. Keep moving, keep pushing, never stop. He had spent years proving himself, climbing higher, gaining more. And yet, sitting here now, in a place so far from his world, he felt something unfamiliar creeping in. Doubt. Raghavan joined him without a word, his presence calm as ever. They sat in silence, the soft murmur of the river filling the space between them. Finally, Kiran spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "You said the king stood at the edge of the dark forest," he said. "Did he go in?" Raghavan exhaled, a small smile playing on his lips. "That, my child, is where the real test began." Kiran waited, heart pounding. The king had come so far. He had given up his throne, his wealth, his name. He had suffered, struggled, fought against the world to reach this point. And now, the final step stood before him. The treasure he sought was just beyond the forest. He only had to walk forward. Raghavan's voice grew softer, but the weight of his words filled the night. But as he stood there, staring into the darkness, something unexpected happened. For the first time in his journey, he hesitated. Not because he was afraid of what lay ahead, but because, for the first time, he questioned whether he had been chasing the right thing all along. Kiran's breath caught in his throat. The whispers of the forest called to him, tempting him forward. "You have come too far to turn back now," they said. "Go on, take what is yours." But something deep inside him resisted. A voice, quiet but insistent, asked, "What if there is nothing beyond this? What if I have already lost more than I can ever gain?" Kiran clenched his fists. He could feel the king's torment as if it were his own. The weight of sacrifice, the fear of regret. He turned back for a moment, Raghavan continued. And when he did, he saw the long path behind him, the people he had met, the lessons he had ignored, the things he had left behind without a second thought. And he realized something. Kiran's pulse quickened. What did he realize? Raghavan's eyes met his, filled with something deep and knowing. That he was never after the treasure at all. He had been chasing a ghost of his own desire, an illusion that had led him further and further away from himself. And now, he stood at the final threshold, realizing that if he took one more step, he might lose himself forever. The air felt heavier, the silence between them almost unbearable. Kiran swallowed hard. So what did he do? Raghavan did not answer immediately. Instead, he studied Kiran with quiet patience, as if waiting for him to understand something on his own. But Kiran wasn't sure he wanted to, because deep down he already knew. This was not just the king's story. It was his. He had been running for years, chasing goals, chasing recognition, chasing something he could never quite name. He had believed that if he just kept moving, kept winning, kept proving himself, he would finally find what he was looking for. But now, sitting here in the stillness of the night, the terrifying thought took root. What if he had been chasing an illusion all along? What if he had already lost more than he could ever gain? His chest tightened, his breath uneven. "Tell me," he whispered, his voice raw. "Did the king turn back?" Raghavan simply watched him, and the silence stretched unbearably. Kiran's heart pounded, because deep down, he already knew the answer, and he wasn't sure if he was ready to face it. Kiran's pulse pounded in his ears as the silence stretched between him and Raghavan. The weight of the moment pressed down on him, his own thoughts spiraling in directions he had never allowed them to go before. He had asked whether the king turned back, but deep inside, he knew the question was no longer about the king. It was about himself. He opened his mouth to say something, anything, but before he could, the faint sound of hurried footsteps reached them. Turning toward the village, he saw a young boy running toward them, breathless and wide-eyed with fear. "Saint Raghavan," the boy gasped. "Something is wrong with Ravi." Kiran felt his stomach tighten. Just earlier, they had left Ravi resting, exhausted from pushing himself beyond his limits. But now, panic flickered through the boy's voice, and Raghavan wasted no time. He stood immediately, moving swiftly toward the village, Kiran following close behind. As they neared Ravi's home, they found a crowd gathered outside, their hushed whispers filling the air with unease. Kiran pushed his way through and froze the moment he stepped inside. Ravi lay on his cot, his body trembling, his breath ragged. But it wasn't just his illness that sent a chill down Kiran's spine, it was the wild look in his eyes, as if he were staring at something no one else could see. His lips moved in broken murmurs, his face drenched in sweat. His mother clutched his hand, whispering prayers, while the villagers stood frozen, unsure of what to do. Raghavan stepped forward, kneeling beside Ravi. He placed a gentle hand on his forehead, his expression unreadable. "Ravi," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Can you hear me?" Ravi's eyes darted wildly, as if trapped in a world of his own. Then, suddenly, he gripped Raghavan's wrist, his fingers trembling but strong. I saw it, he whispered, his voice hoarse. I saw what waits beyond the forest. Kiran stiffened. The words struck him like a thunderclap. Raghavan's face remained unreadable, but Kiran felt a shift in the air, something heavy, something unseen. What did you see, Ravi? The saint asked gently. Ravi's breathing quickened, his grip tightening. His lips trembled as he tried to form the words, his body racked with exhaustion. It called to me, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. A voice, telling me to come closer. It said, it had everything I wanted, that I only had to step forward, just one step, and I would finally have it all. Kiran's blood ran cold. The echoes of Raghavan's story crashed over him with terrifying clarity. The king at the edge of the dark forest. The whispering voices, calling him forward. The moment of hesitation before stepping into the unknown. But this wasn't just a story anymore. Ravi had seen it, felt it, and the fear in his eyes was real. Raghavan exhaled slowly, his gaze never leaving Ravi's face. And did you take the step? Ravi's entire body shuddered. His fingers dug into Raghavan's wrist as he shook his head violently. No, he rasped. I tried. I wanted to, but something pulled me back. It didn't want to let go. Kiran felt his own breath catch. He had thought this was just a lesson, a metaphor for ambition and desire. But now, staring at Ravi's trembling form, he wasn't so sure anymore. Because this wasn't just about chasing illusions. This was about something much bigger, something neither he nor Ravi had fully understood. And something told him that the real test had just begun. The room felt heavy, as if the air itself carried the weight of something unseen. Ravi's breathing was shallow, his trembling fingers still clutching Raghavan's wrist. The villagers watched in silence, their faces tense with fear and uncertainty. Kiran felt his own heartbeat quicken, the pieces of the story swirling in his mind like a puzzle he wasn't sure he wanted to solve. Raghavan placed his other hand over Ravi's, his voice steady. You said something pulled you back. What was it? Ravi's lips parted, but no words came out at first. His body tensed, his fingers tightening until his knuckles turned white. I don't know, he finally choked out. It felt like a force, something strong. It wouldn't let me go forward. Kiran swallowed hard. His mind raced with questions, but none of them had clear answers. The king in the story had stood at the edge of the forest, facing the same choice. But now, the choice wasn't just a story, it was real. Had Ravi glimpsed something beyond desire, something more dangerous? Raghavan exhaled deeply, then turned to the boy's mother. Keep him warm. Let him rest. His battle is not over yet, but he is safe now. The woman nodded, her eyes glistening with relief. The villagers slowly began to disperse, murmuring among themselves, though a shadow of unease still lingered in the air. Kiran remained where he was, his thoughts refusing to settle. As Raghavan stepped outside, he followed. The night air was cold, but it did little to calm the storm inside him. That wasn't just exhaustion, was it? Kiran asked quietly. Raghavan glanced at him, his face unreadable. No. Kiran let out a shaky breath, trying to make sense of it all. What did Ravi see? For a long moment, Raghavan didn't answer. Then, in a voice lower than before, he said, The same thing you have been running toward. Kiran's stomach twisted. What do you mean? Raghavan turned to him fully now, his gaze piercing. Desire, when unchecked, can lead a man to his own destruction. But what you don't realize is that sometimes, desire is not just an illusion, it is a trap. One carefully laid, waiting for you to step forward, believing you are chasing something real. Kiran's mouth went dry. Are you saying, this isn't just about ambition? Raghavan nodded. It never was. A shiver ran down Kiran's spine. All this time, He had thought his journey was about proving himself, about chasing his goals, about being more. But now, he wasn't so sure anymore. The king's story, Ravi's vision, his own hesitation. What if they were all connected? He thought about the way Ravi had described it, that something had tried to pull him in. Not reward him. Not give him what he wanted. But take him. What would have happened if he had taken the step? Kiran asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Raghavan held his gaze for a long moment before replying. He would have lost himself. The word sent a cold wave through Kiran's body. Lost himself. Like a man chasing a dream that never existed. Like a king walking into a forest that would never let him leave. The realization hit him like a thunderclap. All this time, he had believed that stopping was failure. That slowing down meant weakness. But now, he saw the truth. The real test wasn't in pushing forward, it was in knowing when to stop. His whole life, he had been moving towards something he could never name. But maybe, just maybe, what he had been searching for had never been ahead of him. Maybe it had always been right where he was standing. He exhaled shakily, his heart still racing but his mind finally, for the first time in years, clear. He turned to Raghavan, the weight of understanding settling into his voice. The king didn't go into the forest, did he? Raghavan smiled, a quiet knowing in his eyes. No, my child. He turned back. And for the first time in his life, Kiran realized that maybe, turning back wasn't losing at all. Maybe it was the only way to truly win. Kiran stood there for a long time, his mind still absorbing the weight of Raghavan's words. The night around them was silent except for the faint rustling of the trees, the cool breeze carrying with it an odd sense of clarity. 4 years, he had believed that stopping meant failure, that turning back meant giving up. But now, standing here in this quiet village, in the presence of a man who had seen far more than he could comprehend, he realized something he had never allowed himself to consider before. Perhaps the greatest wisdom wasn't in chasing, but in knowing when to let go. His entire life had been a race. A race for success, for recognition, for something that always felt just out of reach. No matter how much he achieved, there was always something more. And yet, for all his victories, he had never felt the peace that Raghavan carried in his every step. It wasn't because he lacked the will to succeed. It was because he had never truly understood what he was chasing in the first place. Kiran exhaled deeply, feeling a weight lift from his chest. And the king? He asked, almost as a final test to himself. What happened to him after he turned back? Raghavan's gaze softened. He walked away from the forest and returned, not as the man he once was, but as someone who had finally found himself. He realized that the treasure he had been seeking was never beyond the trees. It was within him all along. Kiran felt something shift inside him, like a door quietly unlocking after being shut for years. He thought back to all the years he had spent running, pushing, proving. All the times he had ignored the small voice inside him that told him to pause, to breathe, to question. For the first time, he truly listened. The next morning, Kiran woke with a newfound clarity. The village, bathed in the golden glow of dawn, felt different somehow. Or maybe it wasn't the village that had changed. Maybe it was him. He walked toward Ravi's home, unsure of what he would find. When he stepped inside, he saw Ravi sitting up, his skin still pale but his breathing steady. His mother sat beside him, relief in her tired eyes. Kiran hesitated before stepping closer. How are you feeling? Ravi looked at him, and for the first time, there was something in his gaze that hadn't been there before. Understanding. Better, he said quietly. But different. Kiran nodded. I know the feeling. Ravi's hands rested on his lap, fingers absent-mindedly tracing invisible patterns against the fabric of his blanket. I thought I wanted something, he admitted, his voice filled with quiet reflection. I thought if I reached it, I would finally feel complete. But now, I'm not sure I even knew what I was chasing. Kieran sank down beside him, the weight of his own realization settling comfortably in his chest. That's the thing about desire, he said. Sometimes, it makes us believe we need something that was never meant for us. And sometimes, the hardest thing is realizing that what we already have is enough. Ravi exhaled slowly, as if letting go of something invisible. I think I almost lost myself. Kieran met his gaze. But you didn't. Ravi nodded, and for the first time in days, a small, genuine smile touched his lips. As Kieran left the house, the village around him bustled with life, the marketplace filled with voices, children running barefoot through the dusty paths, the scent of fresh bread wafting through the air. It was the same as before, yet something within him had shifted. Raghavan was waiting for him beneath the old tree where they had first spoken. The wise man's eyes crinkled with knowing as Kieran approached. Are you leaving? Raghavan asked, though there was no surprise in his voice. Kieran nodded. Yes, but not in the way I thought I would. Raghavan gestured for him to sit, and Kieran obliged. The silence between them was peaceful, no longer heavy with unanswered questions. You once asked me why the king hesitated, Raghavan said after a moment. Now, do you understand? Kieran smiled, the answer settling deep within him. Yes, he said, because sometimes, the greatest strength is knowing when to walk away. Raghavan's smile widened. Then you have learned what you came here to learn. Kieran looked toward the horizon, where the sun had begun its slow climb into the sky. For the first time in a long while, he wasn't thinking about what came next. He wasn't worried about the road ahead or the expectations waiting for him. For the first time, he simply was. And that, he realized, was enough.